This is the CEO of Sweet Baby Inc. In this video, she says some rather unpleasant things about gamers and about men. Now, as someone myself who is very, very interested in the games industry, but doesn't actually play that many games, I used to, but I just don't find many these days I want to, I am invested in this. And I'm invested in finding her to be completely wrong in most of what she says. But there are some things she says that are interesting, as I said. So, kicking off today, Gamergate 2.0 for Cabal. Here is Kimberly at GDC from 2019.
I'm Kim Belair. I'm a writer, I'm a narrative designer, I'm extremely nervous, and I'm the co-founder of a little narrative development company called Sweet Baby Inc. We do narrative development in games and kind of beyond, and we try to bring a lot of inclusion, diversity, and new ideas kind of to the industry. So just as a kind of fun fact, last year was actually my first GDC, and I first pitched this talk as part of the program Amplifying New Voices, if anyone has heard of it. Yes. I think it's also kind of appropriate that that's where I talked about this because it's also what my talk is about in a lot of ways. So, hi. For a little bit of background on me, I've been a professional writer for about 12 years, but I've always written stuff. I think that's always the way. But when I was a kid, and I want to start at the beginning here because I think that it's important to kind of give context to the way I learned about representation as
You didn't invent Batman 0 for 1. No, I'm kidding. Different video. But yeah, she's just going through the basics. She is, as you can see, not white, but she's not black either. I don't know, chat. She looks like she might be half black at most, but she's gonna take it and run with it that she's black during this video.
Woman of color, and I think the way that a lot of marginalized people kind of get socialized when it comes to topics like this. So when I was small and starting to kind of express myself creatively in either writing or stories or art, I wrote about myself a lot, and I would put myself into a lot of art, into a lot of narratives.
What a shock, by the way. This is what we've been learning for several years, is what women do. And there's nothing inherently wrong with it. But it's especially because she's got the Batman thing on there. An example I heard of this specifically was about Batman, that while Lego did some research in the early 2000s, while boys will try to, if they get a Batman toy, boys will try to understand everything they can about Batman. They will try to learn about him and all the specifics, all the details, all the powers, all the backstory, and try to become Batman. Well, girls, given a Batman toy, will try to make Batman into them. They will make Batman get a haircut, make Batman go to the shopping mall, make Batman, buy fashion, make Batman go out on a girls' night. That's the difference there, and she has just demonstrated here exactly that is exactly her. That she would self-insert constantly into her stories. Now, I don't have a problem with that. That variation between men and women, there are reasons for that, and that's not invalid. Even self-inserting, I don't think is a problem. Obviously, it can go too far. It can be too obvious and too derivative, and it can cheapen the story. But there's nothing wrong with it inherently. Starts a tangent about herself. That is normalville in these kinds of talks. It is normal for them to talk about themselves at first. Usually they only spend like no more than a minute talking about themselves, which I think is fine.
And I put my family and people who look like me in all these cool scenarios. And I was
the Mary Sue thing, Alpaca, that is an example of where a self-insert can go too far. It doesn't have to be a self-insert to be a Mary Sue, but it usually is, I think. Google does this interesting thing, Uzi, my boy. A lot of people at Sweet Baby and some of the ESG, DEI consulting companies have been directly involved and even worked with Zoe Quinn and Anita during the original Gamergate. That Lego whatever person on Twitter who works at Sweet Baby helped Fem Frequency dox people before. Not surprised at all. Not surprised at all. I haven't looked into that in great detail. I'll maybe go into it later, but...
I got to see myself. I got to see people who look like me and kind of a rainbow of people who were kind of adjacent to me in a lot of ways. And I think it was really neat, and I was really fostered in that. So when I hit elementary school, I think that I was free to tell those stories because a lot of the stories that you hear in elementary school are about like, we should be friends with everyone. We should be inclusive. We should preach equality and build communities. And I think this was...
Not everyone heard those kinds of stories when they were young. Those kinds of stories, especially with that wording, is propaganda. It is ideological. It is one side's opinion. And because those terms, whilst they can mean things that are non-ideological, that's not how they're used in practice. Now, probably what she's doing is imposing the terms from a modern understanding onto what she actually read when she was a kid, which did not use those terms. And she's talking about Disney, and this is just her interpretation of Disney or Disney-like products from the 90s for kids, for example, the kind of thing that many of us in Cabal watched. She is now imposing the ideology that she has been poisoned with onto it. For those who don't know, by the way, I expect almost all of you do, if not all of you, but Sweet Baby Inc. is a consulting company which works with game developers and publishers on writing and trying to make the game, I'm trying to be fair here, trying to make the game like acceptable to modern moral sensibilities, by which it means making them into progressive propaganda. That's what her company does. And her company is not the only one. There are many that do, but this is the big one that people noticed on Steam. They made this group saying Sweet Baby Inc. detected, and then it was attacked. People tried to get it taken down. It was defamed on social media. People tried to infiltrate the Discord group, allegedly, although it didn't look like much of an infiltration. They just joined. So that's Streisand affected it, and now everyone knows about it. Recently, by the way, it looks like someone tried to get it taken down by reports spamming it, and then Steam said no. So that's very good news.
It's really, really wonderful. But then I got to high school. And suddenly, for the first time in my life, I got told that the stories that I was writing, the things that I was creating for and about people who resembled me, were not real stories, and they were not right stories. And this was to the point that I received a list that I'm sure many of you have.
So what actually happened there, I expect, is that, okay, so what she's just said is, the stories I was writing, which included people that resembled me, were not real or right stories. And she's showing here Catcher in the Rye, and she's saying, white men equals art. So what she's done here, very clearly, is she has assumed that the reason her stories were not right or real were because they had a brown person in it. You assumed that, but no one actually said that, did they? You assumed that's what they were saying, and so you inferred white men equals art from that. That's not the truth, though. That's not what actually happened. What probably happened is they told you quite clearly that this character is too derivative, it's too much of a self-insert, try to use your imagination and insert characters who are not necessarily exactly you. Would they have cared about the race? Probably not. Not even when she was in school. Given how old she looks, chat, I imagine that she was in school in the 90s, maybe early 2000s at this point. She even says here's high school. So, yeah, 2000s. People at that time were not saying, whoa, hold on a second there, kid. Your story can't have someone in it that has melanin in their skin. Ridiculous notion. If it was 50 years earlier, you maybe would have had a couple of teachers that would have said that. But it wasn't. So I'm calling bullshit here. What's more, I don't think she even realized, I don't think she was even saying this when she was a kid. I think she imposed this on her memories of the situation later on, because it suited her business. Nazi says she has daddy issues, blames people that told her her writing sucks, get revenge by making video games suck. That is certainly one interpretation of this entire story, yes. And I think there is some truth to that. Probably. I don't know exactly, but it's a good suspicion.
Received that was, here's a list of authors and stories that are legitimate. Here's a list of people and stories that are important. And as you can imagine, they were, mostly men and almost exclusively white. And
just like the entire history of the civilizations that you're living in. People don't seem to realize this, but if you look at the stats for racial mix, we have to talk about race, because she is. If you look at the stats of racial mix of the US and the UK in particular, it's a lot different now than it was even 50 years ago. And certainly 100 years ago, it was 90% plus white in all cases. And that has been the case all the way back through history, pretty much. And certainly in the last 100 years or so, particularly in the last 20, 30, and very particularly in the last 10, in some places, that it's been changing significantly. So what you're describing here, woman, is a statistical circumstance. Now, she said that most were white and almost all were male, but not all. If you look at the proportions, it's probable that they match the demographic makeup of people at the time. Phil says white men built all of civilization. White women were very strongly involved in that. They were a necessary part of that process. And people who were not white, but were part of Western culture, who have existed all throughout history pretty much, in very small numbers for the most part, but they have existed, they also help too. The correlating factor there, of course, is the culture, with, of course, each gender specializing. But yeah, generally, the Western civilization is the result of the direct struggle and the indirect struggle. The indirect struggle of men, indirect struggle of women, to a large extent. And books are part of civilization, especially the really popular stories. Now, woman Kim, my dear, do you think that the stories that were presented to you as legitimate and right and real and good, do you think they were selected primarily because of the race of the author? Or do you think they were selected primarily because of the quality of the book? If the latter, then shut up. At least shut mostly up. And if the former, then that's psychosis to think that. Because there's millions of other books that were written by white people that weren't included here. Why were these included and not the other ones? She probably would say that, yes, they're a good quality book, but the books made by black people were not promoted. Well, do you have any suggestions? Do you have any suggestions of, like, books that have been around for decades or centuries that were written by blacks which are widely loved? There may be some. If so, they may have been on that list. She didn't say all of them were whites. Not just blacks either, but other people of other races. And specifically of Western books. Because there have been books and stories from other cultures all throughout history, but you're in a Western school here. You're not in Africa asking, well, why is it all whites? Where are all the black stories? You're in America asking that.
And so were the subjects of all these stories, with a couple exceptions of people who were there to teach lessons to the white male characters, or people who were there to express pain, or people who were there to be the target of some kind of hate or conflict. And if we ever...
Yeah, just because the book depicts non-whites being denigrated doesn't mean that it endorses that. You know, a book is fantasy, right? You know, a book can say more than just what is literally written in it. Writing expert, by the way, on screen right now.
Did read, here's a book by like an African-American author, here's a book by a woman, here's a book by a Japanese author. It was for a lesson that was about, this is what life is like as a woman, this is what pain and suffering is like as a black person. This is what...
So you got special lessons dedicated to your race or gender. Guess who doesn't get that? Whites. When you read books written by white people, it is only incidentally because they're white. What you're reading is the book. The quality of the work is why it's there, not the race of the author. So you got special treatment. You said yourself, not all the books were white males. Some of them were not white males. Some of them were other, white female or black, whatever. But on top of that, you got extra special classes dedicated to your race or gender, despite the fact that their stories were not quite good enough to make it into the general curriculum. That is a privilege. That is special treatment, positive, beneficial special treatment that you and people like you asked for and activized for, pushed for, pressured for, shamed for, no doubt. And you're complaining. But the general group of authors that was selected for being good authors don't include our things as well. So let's have the special stuff and also the general stuff as ours. Oh, it's all ours. You can have one white author, even though almost all of your history is white. This is the absurdity of what she's asking for here, chat.
What pain and suffering is like as a Japanese person. And so through that, and kind of unconsciously, I started to learn that books by and about white men were literature. They were classics. They were important. And everything else is just special interest. They're very, very...
It is because the thing is, these books are about race. That's why it's a genre. Take any story, not necessarily a book, but any story. Say, for example, Blade, a movie where the main character's black, is an example that often pops into my head because I've seen them. They're decent movies and I enjoyed them regardless of the race of the main character. The main character's black. As far as I remember from the movie, they don't really play on that very much. They don't really care that he's black. Maybe it's mentioned once or twice, but the movie is about killing vampires. The movie is not about him being black or about struggles unique to blacks, situations that they think are endemic to blacks. It's about killing vampires, and he was black, and it's well liked. Lara Croft, Tomb Raider, woman. It's not about her being a woman, though it may be mentioned once or twice. They may do something with it. It's about her raiding tombs. So the book you're showing on screen here, Frederick Douglass, An American Slave, that is a quote-unquote marginalized author's genre. That is literally a genre. Because what she's got on screen here, because marginalized author equals genre. That is what that is. It is the genre of racial identity. There is a point in between. You can write about someone who's not white without making it about the fact that they aren't white, without focusing on that. But if you do focus on that, that's what the story's about. So it becomes its own genre. Writing expert, by the way, Kim Belair, writing expert, leader of, in charge of Sweet Baby Inc., literary expert over there on the left of your screen, literary expert, proven a total by my fickle in the moment pontifications.
Niche. And then meanwhile, there's like a young me. And all I wanted out of this whole life was to be a writer. And I wanted that so bad that I kind of said, okay, well, what do I need to be legitimate? And I just internalized everything that I had learned. And
so you're race obsessed from a young age. Who did that to you? Who did that to you? Who made you obsessed with race from a young age? Mother, father, family member, teacher? Who made you think about? Who made you so race obsessed? Maybe it was the literature classes where they made the obsession with race the genre of the literature. Maybe if you were just stuck with the classics and not worried about race, you'd be fine. You wouldn't care, which is the right place to be. I'm going to argue against her positions, not her race, as I am. Race is coming up, but I'm not arguing against her race. She's not wrong because she's black. She's just wrong. She's also black. But some of the beliefs she has may have been influenced by differences in genetics. I don't know. We may get to that later. Googledorf says, I don't think they can do that anymore. The leftist diaspora has killed anything to do with personal accountability. Race and queerness is literally all they have left. Well, they won't last in that case.
For years. And I spent like actual years just writing about white men because I thought, okay, I'm making art now. Because
writing about white men. So we're going to get back to this later, Chad, but you're going to find out that there was actually another reason that she's writing about white men. What she's doing here, I guarantee you, is a retcon. This is not the reason that she was writing about white men. She didn't internalize the lessons that good books only talk about white men. No, that's bollocks. That's not the reason at all. This is something that she's added later. She didn't even realize she's doing it, maybe. But it's a post-fact reanalysis of her life, imposing her modern worldview on her younger self and thinking, that must have been that, which all of us do, but she's just wrong, I strongly suspect. It's not something she was thinking at the time. Not something she was even doing at the time, let alone not aware of. She wasn't even going along those lines. That wasn't the reason for it. We'll find out later in the video chat, though, why she probably the reason why she wrote a lot about white men.
I can look at the stories that are being told, that are being held up as legitimate and as classic, and they look like the stories that I'm telling. And for so many years I did this that I think it was...
But were your stories good? Do you publish any of them? Can we see them? I don't believe you. Or like what she's doing here, and I can only repeat this so many times. I'm going to have to stop at some point. What she's doing here is she is doing literary analysis on the basis of one factor: the race of the characters. One factor. Which is not enough factors, really.
Probably only in my early to mid 20s that I started to realize that I had internalized this like deeply, deeply uninteresting idea that in terms of narratives and stories, white and male are, neutral and universal. And
that is generally the conception in a society which is white. Yes, because males are viewed as uninteresting economic units. Not a nice thing for males, by the way, and you have no idea what that's like, women. Whilst women are viewed as special and unique and interesting and expressive. You don't know what that's like, women. You don't even know that's true. You've never thought about it. The fact that men wear exclusively identical suits, almost identical suits, with almost identical ties, maybe a different color. And there's, very, very few acceptable male hairstyles and beard styles. Here's a weird one that chat asked for. But women, wide assortment. Very expressive. Very much their choice. And jewelry and makeup and all kinds of customization. Not I'm saying I want that, but that's the norm. Is men are viewed as bulk. Women are viewed as special in society. And so what you're identifying here, woman, as white men are viewed as default, is whites are default because they're the majority. That's easy. That would be true in any society. Men are default because they are boring. And that's an evolutionary adaptation. That is gynocentrism. That's normal. But it's also something to bear in mind. It's not all about women all the time. And I'm not saying I think men are boring. I'm just saying that that's the adaptation. That's how they're treated in the sort of comparing the genders. Men are treated as just units of value, units of production. So yeah, they're treated as a default. Also, they're the people that actually do the physical work, and so a lot of these stories are about doing physical, adventurous, difficult things. Women support that process. Women raise the next generation. Women do a lot of very useful things, but they don't generally directly do the interesting things in society. That's usually men. So that's why they're the default for stories. It's just very easy to explain, but what she's coming at this from, the angle she's coming from, is that white, doesn't matter who the majority number is, whites being the default, this is wrong. Okay, well, that's already questionable, but then she would also add to that, men and women are the same, no difference. Therefore, white men being the default, it just was racism and sexism. Just give up halfway through. Don't look for a different answer. And that's something, unfortunately, I've seen people do a lot, where if you see an unbalance, you just assert the reason for that unbalance. For example, must be democracy. Because the evil people keep talking about it. Look, they're wearing the skin suit. It must be real. Same thing. You insert a cause without looking at what the cause actually is. Same thing with the wage gap, by the way. That's the ultimate problem with the wage gap. Men and women earn different amounts. Must be sexism. Done. Job done. No thought required. But there's dozens of other reasons that it could be. And it turns out sexism, if you do the factor analysis, sexism is a tiny, tiny little factor. And within the margin of error. Because there have been studies that actually try to figure that out. And it's within the margin of error. Same thing here. She sees white men are the default, which is a much more subjective claim, by the way. Not even necessarily true anymore. Because of all this racial ideology. And she assumes, it must be racism and sexism. Job done. Thought ended. All these democratic leaders, they're corrupt. Must be democracy. Their thought ended. No further investigation required. Never mind the fact that they exist exclusively where democracy has been eroded.
I say that even as a woman of color. So while we don't all fall into that trap, I say it to kind of illustrate how easy it is, I think, for us to kind of take on that narrative, even as people who are marginalized, even as we're fighting, because we've kind of created this normal that we all unconsciously follow. And
this is big leftist ideology. It's old leftist philosophy about unconscious bias. And it's not like it's completely wrong, which is where it gets its takeoff. But the problem is that it asserts that biological evolutionary norms are choices that we have made. And it tacitly posits, never explicitly, but tacitly posits, that absolute equality between every group is the expectation that we should follow. Which is bollocks. It's complete nonsense. And I'm not just talking about equality under the law or equality of rights access. I'm talking about complete equality. I'm saying that if they find a difference between two groups, no matter what it is, no matter what context it is, unless it's something very obviously biological, like women have breasts and men don't, except some. Unless they find something very obviously biological, if it's a difference, they assert it is a choice of society and evil. You all know this. This is basic knowledge that we could have said 10 years ago, speaking of the last Gamergate. But this is the leftist philosophy this is all based on, and it is total nonsense. And funny enough, this is why I keep saying the right could do very well by just utilizing evolution as a mental model for things. Because what the left is doing here, despite the fact that the atheists generally these days are on the left, the atheists are the ones who believe the most in evolution, who accept it the most. Despite that fact, what they're saying, their philosophy about human morality and human culture completely flies in the face of evolution. So the right would be very wise to use it as their model instead.
It affects us even as we advocate for change. There are things and times, like back in the day, if you'd asked me, oh, are you doing this on purpose? Are you only telling stories that fit the dominant narrative? I would never have said yes. But I think that a lot of people end up doing it even as they're saying we have to do better. And I think that that's actually shown in the way that we manage representation, which we still consider it this like deviation from something that is normal. And
well, so you write stories with the goal of making it about your race. But your stories don't get particularly popular, do they, Kim? Nor do the stories of other people writing exclusively about race. Except, of course, in the lessons you mentioned earlier, where it's forcibly about race to kids, which I find abhorrent. Except in those cases, you don't get those stories published. And is that because people don't care about the race? Or is it because the stories aren't very good? It's because the stories aren't very good, isn't it? Even today, you don't get stories published, do you? You're not doing that anymore. Instead, what you're doing is you're trying to make other people's stories about the thing that you couldn't get published. Or maybe didn't try, maybe couldn't have, even if you had tried. Once again, we come back to the Tolkien quote of evil does not create anything. It just changes and ruins what good has made. I don't know if this woman in particular is in any sense evil. She probably is in some sense, but probably not in any way that she's aware of. But in practice, what she's doing is imposing unwelcome and damaging story focuses on stories which would otherwise have been fine, maybe even very good, and changing them into what she wants to read about. Not what the public wants to read about, not what will be successful, not even what's right for society, just what she wants to read about. So once again, we come back to the Batman example, where girls will make it about them. They'll try and turn everything into themselves. Like the Borg.
Representation is this like very, very scary and very uncertain thing. And if we do it wrong, or if we don't do it, accurately, or if we kind of take a risk, we might get shouted down, and that fear is enough to stop us. And I think like that sucks. And it's such a bummer because it's the only way sometimes that we end up talking about it. We end up saying we're going to share our stories of microaggressions, which I am going to do today, but we share stories of trauma and of doubt. And when we're dealing with narratives in advocacy, we end
Microaggression. Wow, you can speak English fairly well. That's, by the way, what a microaggression is. Actually, is that even? Because microaggressions are like compliments which imply an expectation that it wouldn't have been true, when that expectation is quote-unquote racist. Wow, you suck well. Wonder if any of our employers have ever said that. It's right on the screen there. We just need an arrow pointing from it sucks to her face.
End up going like, okay, these stories are stirring and they're beautiful, but they're
I'm being crass. If anyone were to clip this and like say, look at this arsehole misogynist attacking her, that's the bit they would clip, isn't it? Not the genuine analysis that I've done around it. Don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. Don't worry. Just put a link and see what people think. If you're courageous enough, put a link to my content. See what they think about it.
Also very sad and very heartbreaking. And I think it's important to do that. It's important to share like all of those painful stories if we're going to actually understand the struggle and convey the struggle. But I think today I'd like to take a moment and kind of assume the best, because I want to assume that all of you are here in this advocacy talk because what I've said so far is already familiar, already painful, and I want to kind of assume that you have sat with that, or if it's not your experience, you've already sat and listened to that in other areas. And rather, I think, than spending the next 15 or so minutes kind of sitting in that pain, I want to share some examples from my own experience and then kind of discuss how we can do better and find different and more interesting ways of talking about this stuff as creatives and as advocates and as people who overall want practical solutions to these kinds of problems. So let's talk about video games. To begin, a lot of the work that I do is in narrative consultation and narrative design. And one of the things that I offer as part of my list of services is risk assessment and sensitivity reading.
Yeah,
and
risk assessment, by the way, is, and I'm like not an exaggeration, but also not directly about them, but still not an exaggeration. You need to do this so that you can be free of the risk of what will happen if you don't do this because of us. And again, not because of Tweet Baby, but because of the press. What they're doing here is they are trying to change the story so that the press doesn't get upset. which means the press sets the standard. Which, funnily enough, there was a movement about 10 years ago complaining about that problem, wasn't there? The press controls the narrative of video games, and the press is